Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band podcast. I'm your host, Benedikt, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood. How are you, Malcolm?
Hello, I'm great, Benny. How are you, sir?
I'm great, thank you. I had a wonderful weekend. Yesterday was one of the
fantastic.
best days in a while. Like, I don't know, it was just perfect. Perfect winter day, so much fun with the kids. We did so much yesterday. I don't know why that is not the norm, actually, but like it's we tend to have fun on weekends, but yesterday was special. We were out in the snow, and then we got in and we played Xbox, and then we did like, what else did we do? We played the piano, made some music with the kids. I went cross country skiing. We like all these different activities in one day. It was just a perfect day yesterday.
That sounds like a pretty great day, gotta say. Well done.
Yep. Well rested today, and I jumped right into some not last minute, but like, the typical busyness before the holidays. But I feel ready and rested for it, so it's cool.
Yes, yeah. I know exactly what you mean with the busy last minute holiday stuff. It's like, we got to get these albums done before Christmas so we can all stop thinking about it.
Yeah,
that's the main reason. Everybody wants to just leave this year behind them. Check the boxes. It's funny.
For sure. So how was your weekend? Okay, sorry.
It was good. It's good. It's kind of the same. Just trying to tick off all of the projects that we can before the new year. I'm going away on a trip to Mexico, which I'm very excited about. I'm sure there's people in different places of the world that just can't believe that I'm able to go on a vacation in a different country, because the COVID situation seems to be very different in different places. So if that is you, I'm sorry. That sucks. But luckily, we're in a position where we can do that for now. So very excited to go somewhere warm. That used to be like a very common thing for me, taking off to a warm place in the winter. So looking forward to that. Just ticking off all the boxes I can on projects that I've got going on. And it's been going awesome. Had like a couple different mastering projects come back with the thumbs up on the first try, which is always nice, For sure. Normally on singles, it always goes that way with mastering, because like, it's just one song to think about. People don't really overthink it. And mastering is kind of like that in nature. But EPs, usually there's something, EPs and albums. But this time it was just, everybody was like, we're stoked. Let's release this. Great. There we go.
Perfect. That's the best. Yeah. Just a quick little question on that, just out of personal interest. Do you, like when you sent the first master, have you at this point prepared all the different versions and formats like ready to go? So if they sign off, like you can just send them and you're done? Or are you just like setting them one thing, and then when they sign off, you have to actually create all the things?
It depends on the deliverables. So if it's just the one version of the song they sent me, then yes, it's all prepared. I just do it all at that time, and if they approve it, I'm just like, yeah, go ahead. It's ready to be released. Okay, cool. But often there's like instrumental versions and whatnot as well that have to get run through, and I don't do those until the primary is approved.
Yeah. Okay. But so like the different, I don't know how many, like which deliverables you give to bands, but like the, I don't know, 44, 1, 16 and the high res or whatever you do, like these are all ready, or is it just one master to rule them all?
Again, totally on deliverables. So it's 44.1 and an MP3, just because I like to make sure that there's a decent codec going through, like that it's just not being done like on like makemp3.com or something. So I like to provide that. So those two are delivered. FLAC versions and stuff like that have to be requested.
Okay, cool. All right, got it. Cool.
You know why I started doing that? This is worth mentioning, I think. I was providing 4824s, and people kept trying to upload them to their distribution companies and getting errors, because distribution companies like CD Baby, one of the biggest, don't accept it.
Despite you explaining what the different things were for, I assume, like you didn't just send them.
I think it was doing more harm than help. So it's now upon special request. If they want it and they know what they're using it for, we can do it. But
interesting. I never had that, but I also never asked. So maybe some people got errors. Like I send like a standard 44.1, and then I send a high res /video thing, like just as you described. And then I send, it depends on what they request. But those two are like the basics that I send out. But I never had anyone like complaining that they couldn't upload anything. So
I just kept getting emails. It was going to be like an FAQ. It was so frequent, people just couldn't figure out what they were meant to do with this file, because they don't really understand what the difference is often, right?
Yeah.
What really sealed it for me though was our friend Bobby Balo, who has a pretty cool YouTube channel. He's just a very scientific guy, and he did some tests and found that 44.1 was actually outperforming on YouTube than 48, which is totally not what you would expect, because 48 is typically how the video world works, but just how the YouTube kind of system deals with audio, apparently you're getting a cleaner result with a 44.1 file. So it's going to stick with that unless people want the other.
Yeah.
It's been the standard for my entire life. So
cool.
It's pretty safe.
Yeah. I mean, but that's depending on, I mean, this is too much for this episode, but like that's depending on the video format, right? I think the 48 works if it's embedded in a container format that is able to play back the lossless audio thing. It's just as problematic when people create like, I'm not sure, I'm probably getting it wrong now, but the way I understood it is when you create an MP4 or something that has the 48 in it, it causes problems. But if you create some other format that has the 44.1 in it, and it's like actually playing the lossless thing, then that is better than the MP4. It's something like that. So I think 48 works well, but you have to do it a certain way to make it work.
Right. Which I think, honestly, I think providing that is, it's unlikely that it's going to happen, right?
Yeah. I'm already glad if people don't upload videos that are in mono. So I'm already happy if that doesn't happen, because that's the classic, I don't know, like these video people.
I'm so glad you're mentioning that. That happens like once a year. It's insane. If you were making a music video, please send it to your engineer, whoever mixed it, or your producer at least, and be like, what do you think of this before you release it, before you approve it? Because video people not always, but more often than it should happen, end up bouncing their video out, and the audio is in mono for some reason. They've just, I don't know how it happens or why it happens. Nobody's ever explained to me what happens. They've just been like, "Oh, I'm sorry about that," but then I fixed it, and I'm like, "That's great, but why is this happening? I don't understand."
Yeah, same. Just happened to me. That's why it was top of mind. Like a band is releasing a single next Friday, and they sent the video to me. I didn't request it, but they sent it to me. Hey, check it out. We're so proud of this video, and I'm like, cool, but like the song is in mono. And the weird thing is they had a sound effect in the middle of it, like some sample that's not in the actual song, that's just in the video, and that was stereo, but the song itself was mono.
Oh no, that must have sounded crazy.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm like, why is this like short sample stereo and all the rest is mono? And like, yeah, there was some mistake obviously, but they just checked it on phones and didn't notice. And so
yeah, it's a bummer when it happens, because I mean, you put so much into this song, and then now the video representation of it just sounds terrible.
Yeah, exactly. We glad we caught it before the release, so they had actually a chance to re-upload it, but sometimes it's too late. So, all right, let's get into today's topic, I think, today's episode. Yeah. And we are about to answer the question of all questions, like the most important audio question on the internet, I think, and that is, why does your snare sound like shit? I mean, this is, I think, honestly, a lot of people in our community as well, I think, I'd have to look it up, but I think the most asked question that I ever got is like, how to make a snare sound awesome. And it doesn't only happen to us, it happens to everybody in the audio world. I think people for whatever reason, are struggling with snare sounds a lot. And it's become a meme at this point. Like snare sounding like shit is like an internet phenomenon. And and I remember myself, like years ago when I started, I remember how frustrating it was comparing my snare drum sounds to like real professional productions. And for whatever reason, the snare was also, in my case, was also always the thing that stood out to me, and that I just couldn't get right. And instead of telling you how to mix the snare, because there's not only one way, we're trying to explain to you what could go wrong or what might cause your snare to sound weird compared to your favorite records. Does that make sense? So
yep, absolutely. Cool. Yeah, it is just this crazy trend on the internet. People just love making fun of snares, and like usually there's nothing wrong with it, but it's just something people like to say. But it's kind of like there's always humor in the truth, and it's more so less about snares sucking, and it's more so about how hyper focused we all are as engineers and music people on snares. Like it's been that way forever. Like even going to live shows, I'm like, oh, that's a really nice sounding snare. Oh, this band's snare sucks.
Why do you think that is? What is it that makes us focus on the snare so much?
I don't know. There's something satisfying about when it's right, though, right? It kind of hits in this nice way. it's satisfying. It just is. But I couldn't tell you. I mean, kicks kind of had their moment, I feel like, too.
Yeah.
You know, like early 2000s metal, people were like, more click.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Now it's snares. And I think snares are more deserving.
Yeah, I think so too. Maybe it's because it's the backbeat or like the 2 and the 4 that's like really important. And I learned, I didn't know that a couple of years ago, but I've learned that this is apparently very different from like country to country. Some people clap on 1 and 3, others clap on 2 and 4. Some cultures are more like, in some cultures or some genres, the 1 and the 3 are more important than the 2 and the 4. I don't know, but maybe we all in rock or whatever or in American culture, or I don't know, maybe we all gravitate more towards the backbeat, the 2 and the 4. Maybe that's so important. Also, I think to me, the snare drum is sort of the most characteristic element of a drum kit. It's like the voice of the kit to me.
Right.
So everything else is sort of, I mean, it all matters, but toms, to be honest, are not that important. Cymbals, as long as they don't suck, they are cymbals, you know. But like the snare is sort of the voice of the kit. It's loud. I don't know. There's something about it. Yes, like you said, it's when it's right, it's just satisfying, and when it's wrong, you can immediately tell. And to be honest, I've heard a lot of productions that are not so bad, but when the snare really sucks, I can't really listen to it. Like it can ruin a whole mix for me if it's like, and it does. It's not a matter of like a certain way it has to be done, but it just if it doesn't fit, that's what I'm trying to say. If it's like just off for some reason, that's the problem, I think. So
yeah, that makes sense. It is kind of like the most full range sound on a drum kit as well. You know, cymbals are kind of the highs, kicks are the lows, and toms are usually kind of more associated with low rumble as well. The snare is kind of both. I mean, it doesn't go super subby, but a good snare usually has some punch in it, right? Like where you feel it. So it's getting like that low mids at the very least. So maybe that's why, I don't know, it's always center and it's very constant as well. So we just focus on it and we like them.
Yeah. All right, and let's try to explain what could go wrong or what the common problems are with a snare drum. So
for sure, yeah. And I think our list starts almost in order of importance, but not quite. I mean, maybe, I don't know. It's a long list. We're probably going deeper than we need to, but I tried to kind of quickly order things and this is fairly important in this order, but it's not entirely like that, and it is dependent as well. You know, what might make the difference for one drummer might not make the difference for another. So just keep that in mind as you're listening to us go through this list, listeners.
All right. Okay, so let's start with the fundamentals, basically, like the foundation, which is tuning, head selection, muffling, dampening, and the actual snare wires. So the instrument itself, basically, like how it's set up, how it's sounding on its own. So that's, I think, one of the most important things, and it affects everything because it doesn't only affect the snare close mic, but it affects the overheads. Like even if you replace it with samples, it's going to be everywhere. So the basic characteristic of the snare, how it's tuned, high pitch, low pitch, if it's ringy, if it's dead, if it's like too muffled, too dead, if it's too open, all these things. If there's a long like decay, if the snare wires are really audible, or if that's a really short snap. If you've picked the right head, if you've got plenty of attack or like a more, I don't know, like, it totally depends. Like all these things change the characteristic of the drum itself. And no matter what you do after it, will always have this sonic like footprint, this characteristic baked into it. So it's really important to pay attention to that, even if you plan to replace it later. So if you really know you won't use the snare at all, then maybe you should try to eliminate it, or like eliminate the annoying parts of it as much as possible in the overheads, like because some of it will still come through no matter what.
Totally, yeah. I don't know if we've ever said that before, but even if you plan to replace it, it will still be in the overheads and the rooms. Like, I mean, that's obvious to us, but I don't think it's something we've ever actually said on this podcast, and that might be a little bit of a misconception. There isn't really replacing drums. You say sample replacement, but it's not full 100% replacement. And there's some really clever tricks to make it close to 100% replacement, but it's not really totally possible. And that's worth remembering. So even if you think your snare is a placeholder, you're going to be stuck with it.
Yeah. So some of the most common mistakes here, or things that could go wrong, and again, we don't go into too much detail. We just give you the things you need to be aware of, basically, because there are so many different ways to tune a snare drum and all of that. That would be an episode on its own. But some common things I want to give you listeners, and that to me, those are if the pitch, like the tuning of the snare just doesn't match the song or the genre. And I don't mean like the note. I don't care about the note being tuned to the song or something like that. But I mean, in some genres, a low-tuned, very dead, fat snare, for example, works well. And in others, like a high-pitched, ringy snare would work well. And like, there's always taste and there's no right or wrong. But sometimes it's just right and sometimes it just sounds wrong. So so mistake number one is just a weird tuning or a weird tuning choice for the genre you're making. So that could be a problem. Maybe you're comparing you're recording your song to something else and they use an appropriate tuning and it just works and you like how that sounds and you're not aware that no matter what you do in mixing or with microphone placement or whatever can get you close to that because you've tuned it completely differently. Like yours is lower or higher or longer or shorter or whatever. So if you want to achieve a certain snare sound, make sure you are also in the ballpark of that tuning and that sound, basically. So the wrong pitch is where I'd start.
Yep, that's definitely wise. I like to just have a couple snares on hand so we can just quickly shoot them out. They're usually hopefully tuned a little bit differently, and it's kind of like different flavors. One's going to be in the right ballpark. It's just like trying out different guitars. Like, is it a Les Paul or a Tele song? Oh, this Tele is easily the choice. That kind of is like a rapid fire and easier thing to do rather than being like, okay, can you crank that snare up way higher? I want to see what it sounds like now. You can do that, but it's kind of like more work. It's just really quick if you have snares that kind of have their natural spots they like to live in. If you've spent any amount of time with your snare drums collection, if you have a collection, you've kind of figured out where they sound best, hopefully by experimenting.
Sure, agreed.
And yeah, it's funny because I'm pretty sure, Benny, you and I both like lower, fatter snares.
Often, at least, yeah. I started enjoying the higher pitch ones more lately, but like in general, I like a snare that has body and like weight to it. Yeah,
big fat splat. Yeah, and then I was just listening to one of my favorite records like the other night. It's called "Bringing Down the Horse" by the Wallflowers, and it's got a piccolo snare on it, just like the whole album, and it's so good. It's perfect. And piccolos are like those really skinny, high-pitched snares for you listening. So it really was a reminder. It was like, yes, it's what you like as a snare by itself isn't necessarily the perfect choice. So hearing it in context is everything.
Yeah, totally agreed. So the other two things that I wanted to say about this point here, about this first point, like the common mistakes are making the snare too dead. So a lot of people can't stand the sound of a ringing snare, of a ringy snare, and they think they have to use a lot of moongel or even worse, like tape or whatever, to make it really dead because they think it's annoying. When in reality, not all of that ring you hear in the room will make it into the recording. Like a lot of it will be masked by guitars and by cymbals and all that stuff. So it will be probably much less annoying than you think. But what you're doing is you kill the attack and the volume of the snare. So if you make it too dead, it will be like a cardboard, basically. There's no sound to it. It's not open enough. So I see it a lot of times, like when I used to produce, people were always surprised by how open I would have I would like to make my snares, and they were always worried that it's going to be too annoying, too ringy. And I'll always be like, "You'll be fine. Like, let's check it out when it's recorded. It will be there. It has to be loud enough. It has to have the crack, the impact, the attack, and what you are used to hearing in your jam space will not work well in the context of the whole loud thing." So I think that's a very common mistake, that people think they've controlled the snare when they've actually completely killed it. So
yeah, you can be hyper focused on the different frequencies coming off your drum and think that they're all bad, where in fact they are the sound of your drum. Yeah. So it's a balancing act for sure, because there is such thing as too much for sure. You know, there can be way too much rig, and that's got to be dealt with. But it's all, again, going back to context, that helps a lot. If you have like good solid scratch tracks you can throw the track up against, that will make a world of difference in helping you gauge if a sound in a drum is a problem.
Yeah. And then the last thing is, to me at least, is a common mistake that I used to make also, is a snare bottom head that is that's not tight enough. So let me explain real quick. What I like to do when I like to have a deep, low tuned snare drum that is fat and, like as you described, like that sort of characteristic, I like to bring down the better head. Like that can be a little more loose and like lower, but I like to still have a pretty tight resonant side, like a pretty tight lower bottom head. And the reason is, if that is really tight, you'll get all the snap and you get a quickly reacting snare wires, which if that is like not the case, if it's too loose on the bottom, it always sounds weird and cheap to me. Like the snare wires don't really react properly. They are a little late, or like they don't, like there's no snap, and it almost always sounds cheap to me. So instead of cranking the top head and turning down the bottom head, I like to turn down the top head. Depends on how much rebound you want from the head and all that, but I like to still pretty much crank the bottom head just to get these quickly reacting, snappy snares. And that to me just works. And oftentimes when I listen to snare bottom mics of people who send me drums to mix, I completely throw them away or mute them just because the lower head is not tuned properly. And oftentimes that means it's too loose. It's not tight enough, not snappy enough, too slow, whatever. I'll get rid of it. And if it's done properly, you can have a low-tuned fat snare that's still snappy and has all the crack, and that still cuts through the mix properly.
Right. Yeah. I'm a big fan of what the bottom of the snare can do for a drum sound, even if you're not miking it. By the way, just because you're not throwing a bottom mic on doesn't mean that what's going on down there doesn't matter. It totally matters. Probably more because you have no close mic to help control what's going on down there now. So where I would go next in this conversation is like how many wires you're throwing on down there. To me, that makes such a huge difference in the drum sound. I usually like pretty thick strands. Not the strands aren't thick, but the amount of wires on the strand is thick, like 30 around there kind of thing. It's like a big fat snare strand. I love how that sounds. It actually sounds less buzzy to me.
Yeah.
Adding more, because it's just more of like a solid response. I don't know. It sounds so great, I think. And
I know what you mean. It's easier to tune also. I think the thinner wires, or like less wires basically, are harder to control because they sometimes have this weird buzz, like not the actual snare buzz, but like after that there's sometimes this, you know what I mean?
Yep.
Like
absolutely.
the stuff
the
you
mosquitoes.
don't want. Yep. So that's the really annoying part. Like if it's well tuned, well centered, then that shouldn't happen. But it's more likely to happen with less wires, to me at least. Like it's, as you said, it's a more solid thing. It's a little more buzzy or louder, like the snare wires, but it's not an annoying buzz. So yeah, to me, I think that's totally right. If done well, like you could do with less or with like, yeah, it can absolutely work. But to me, it's also easier. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. I had both work like all the time, but
of course.
Just worth playing with. I think a lot of people are pleasantly surprised when they try throwing a big fat wire on.
Yeah. Agreed.
So while we were planning this episode, I was thinking, okay, like what are the most common things that make me think, oh, the snare is just a disaster? And it's usually when I get a reference mix from a band that's like considering me for mixing, and they're like, hey, this is like, what do you think? How have we done so far? And a very often problem is that the snare is just totally out of phase.
Yeah.
And it's just like, okay, that's a disaster. And if I just fix that, you'll think I'm a like mixing genius.
Yep.
And so it's just that's pretty much the point, is you have to check the phase between your mics and make sure your snare mic is totally in phase. Me and many other engineers like me treat the snare as like the master. It's like a phase gets based on our top snare mic. That's like the most direct sound we're getting, and everything's going to be conformed to make that work. And usually the most commonly missed thing is just flipping your overheads or your bottom snare mic, and just making sure those two things, if you get those two right, it's probably going to work out pretty good. Because I like to check all my mics against it, like my toms and hi-hat and whatnot. But you definitely want to make sure the bottom snare and your overheads are especially important when it comes to like the phase coherency of your snare mic.
Yes, 100% phase, such a big one. Yeah. That's probably has the most impact of all the things on our list here. If it's wrong, like you can completely eliminate all the good stuff about your snare.
Yeah,
if that's just wrong.
And like it's at the top of our list because it happens all the time. So, one worth mentioning. And like I said it as if it only matters when you're mixing, but Benny and I we strongly encourage you to get this right while tracking. It makes it way more rewarding. You're playing to a drum kit that has punch now. I think it's so important to get right. It's part of engineering drums, and that's like that alone is a reason to go into a studio to record drums. If you can't figure that out on your own or don't have what you need to do it, like just having an in-phase snare kit, it like creates the picture that you're recording the rest of your instruments to.
Totally. Like, how do you know if the drum sound will work when you're actually not listening to the final drum sound? You're listening to a canceled like version of it. That's not what it's going to be in the end. So yeah, totally have to get it right. I agree.
It's so uninspiring.
Yeah, totally. All right. So the next thing is also happening at the source, and that is playing technique. And that's also such a big one to me. And that's to me that most of the time simply means you're not hitting hard enough. So not hard or not consistent enough. It's not always about like having to hit it full on, like depends on the genre, but usually it's good to hit a snare really hard, even if it's not the most heavy stuff you're making. Like if you've ever watched a really good drummer, the force they are able to like put into the snare drum is pretty incredible. It doesn't look like it, but it's really loud. Like they play it really loud and they play it consistently. And if you're standing in front of a kit in a room where a really good drummer plays the kit, you'll notice that they control the cymbals pretty much. Like it's not like cymbals all over the place. It's not annoying, but they really hit the shells hard and consistently. We've talked about that a couple of times. And that doesn't only, what that does is not only does it make the snare louder, it sounds different. It sounds completely different. Just do the experiment. Just try it. Like mic a snare drum, hit it like hard, hit it soft, and then compare the different hits, the different volumes. Compare those at equal volume, and you'll find that it's not only like a volume difference; it's a drastic tone difference. It completely sounds different. Like the snare drum only starts to sound open and full and big and explosive once you hit it hard enough. Mm-hmm. And I know that it's not important for like it's important, but it's not like there's no one technique for all genres. But in general, at least in the stuff that I'm working on most of the time, people are not hitting hard enough. It just sounds weak.
Yeah, it's wildly important. And the next like that's half of the coin. The other half of the picture here is I just changed metaphors halfway through a sentence there. But the other side of it is the consistency and accuracy that it is being hit with. So it's I mean, that's great if you can smack the snare hard 10 times in a row, but can you do it for a 5-minute, 6-minute song? You know, these people that have these giant epics, and it's just impossible without a lifetime of skill to be able to play the drum to a studio level for that entire performance, right? So you really have to work at that and just become a total beast at hitting your drum the same way every single time. Yeah. And that is, again, the velocity and strength that you're hitting the drum, but also the spot you're hitting your drum. I'm sure many drummers and people, guitarists who are sneaking onto their drum kit before the drummer shows up for practice have seen like a circle drawn in the center of their snare drum, and that's there just to train you as like accuracy. Hit here. This is the spot, right? Yeah. And it's really hard. It's super hard, but it's amazing what a good studio drummer can do to that circle. They can just demolish that one spot. It's pretty crazy. And there's nothing more worth investing your time in than that technique, I think. If you want to be like a studio level drummer, is just become a beast of dynamics.
Yes. Also knowing the difference between rim shots and no rim shots.
Yes.
That sort of thing. It's also super important. And you have to learn that stuff and really like practice. There's no way around it. You have to put in the work, and it will take time. But when you get there, if you've ever seen a drummer who really nails that, it's fascinating. It's incredible to watch those drummers and listen to those drummers play.
Our working title is Why Your Snare Sounds Like Shit. I'm not sure if you're going to use that for the actual thing. I hope we do.
Probably not.
But I think we should just add a point, and your snare sounds like shit because you're not doing a rim shot.
Yeah, exactly. Period.
They're so much better almost all of the time.
Almost all of the time. Exactly. Cool. So I'll let you talk about the next one because you put it on the list here, stereo placement.
Yes. So this is again going back to like getting mixes from people being like, what do you think? And it's another telltale sign of it not sounding pro to me is that the snare is leaning hard left or hard right. Not hard, but more than it should be. Snares are something we like want up the center pretty well every time. And if you have done a bad job at placing your overheads or whatever you're using to like create the stereo image of your kit, you might have your snare leaning hard one way or the other. And that doesn't create a very good listening experience usually, especially with your, samples or main snare mics up the middle, but you hear this like weird distant sounding version of it off to one side. It's just another common thing that is totally ruining the drumming experience of listening to the song.
Agreed. 100%. Totally. So, yeah.
Careful with that.
Yeah.
I guess the actionable on that is measure your snare to your overheads. Just make that distance the same. That'll go a long way.
Yeah, there will sometimes be a trade-off because usually you'd want the kick and the snare in the center. But if I have to make a decision, if it's not possible to have both because of like how the cymbals are placed and like other factors, I'd prioritize the snare drum. I think you can filter out a lot of the low end of the kick, and I don't know. When in doubt, I would prioritize the snare.
I agree.
Cool. All right. So the next one is snare. We've already kind of covered it. It's snare bleed in overheads and other mics. So what I mean by that is even if you try to eliminate the snare in your overheads or rooms, you will always have some snare in there. It's like there's no way around it. And that can really mess with your final snare sound. Even if you've replaced it with a sample, if the snare has a cardboard quality to it, like a cheap sort of sound, even with the best sample, there will be some of that quality in there. And it can really, depending on a few different things, it can really cause problems. And I think it's always worth paying attention to that and listening to the overheads in the rooms and how the snare sounds in those. It might not sound spectacular, but it shouldn't be really problematic or very cheap sounding.
Yeah. So the problem here, the problem here isn't that there is snare in your overheads or your other mics. There will be. There's bleed of everything. If it's happening in the room, you're hearing it, right? Yep. But the problem is if that bleed is bad. And this is like something that happens all the time with like hi-hat bleed into a snare mic. People are just like freaking out. I can hear the hi-hat. It's like, well, does it sound bad? If not, it's probably going to be okay. And then that's a whole nother episode. The volume of it is very important too, but
yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think it depends on the genre and like what you're going for when it comes to drum sound. And a lot of people skip that decision or that thought process. What I mean is you can set up overheads in a way that they are primarily cymbal mics, and you can set them up in a way that they are kit mics. And we have an entire episode on that if you want to go back and listen to that. And the thing is, it can sound awesome if there's a lot of snare and a lot of kit in the overheads. So if that's intentional, that's super awesome. And maybe you just need a little bit of the close mic and that works for the genre. But sometimes people want a super modern, precise, like metal sort of sound, and they want to use a lot of samples, and they actually don't like the way the snare sounds in the overhead. So if you just pick the wrong approach for your overhead technique and you capture too much of the kit, then you get problems when it comes to mixing a drum kit, and you have to do all sorts of tricks to get rid of the snare. So it's worth thinking about this when you set up the session and how you, like when you make the decision about how you're gonna position your overheads, because you might want to angle them away from the snare, or you might want to put them closer to the cymbals. You want to treat them as cymbal mics more if you don't want the snare in the overheads. Whereas if you like the sound of the snare in the overheads and you want a more organic, complete picture of the kit in there, you can do it differently, and then that's okay. So it's all about being intentional.
Yeah.
And in case it's already too late, like if you have tracks that have the snare in there but you don't want it in there, there are ways to get rid of it. So maybe the reason why your snare is not sounding the way you want it to sound is because you haven't controlled the overheads enough in the mix. So maybe you should not just like high pass it and like add some top end and get rid of the resonances. Maybe you should also throw a limiter on there, and maybe one that is actually killing the transients, like the opposite of what you would do on a master, for example. Like if you put L1 or something like that on overheads, or there are like cheap limiters, stock limiters can work well for that. If you put that on your overheads and set it so that it just affects the snare but leaves the cymbals alone, these limiters can get rid of much of the snare, make it sound a little longer, kill the attack a little bit, make it like sink into the mix more, and leave more space for the actual close mic to come through. So maybe you have to do more of that. Maybe you have to clip the overheads. Maybe you have to do some sort of tricks to get rid of the snare as much as possible in those. And if you've not done that, if your overheads are very dynamic and there's the loud snare transient in those overheads, that might be the reason why your snare doesn't sound good despite you using your favorite samples or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, again, like you said, it kind of depends on the snare sound you're going for in your head. But that is for people that don't know how to mix like kind of modern sounding records where you want that very direct sound. That's a total common mistake, is like thinking that overhead stuff's helping, where it's just kind of confusing like the focus of the drum sound.
Yeah. All right. So the actual room, like not the room mics, but the actual room you're recording in has like also plays a role, and that's different. Like a room can add to the snare sound and can make it sound awesome, but it can also be the reason why it sounds like shit. So totally depends. Like if you're in a small, untreated room that just doesn't sound great, but that's very audible and obvious in your recording, that might be a problem. It might might make your snare sound like, cheap and like this typical jam space sounding recording where you hear those reflections from the wall, but they're not really reverb, not really a big room, not really ambience, but it's this weird quality to the snare drum that's just hard to get rid of. So yeah, that's, I think, a pretty common problem when people record drums in less than ideal spaces.
Yep. Yeah. Episode 97, we talk about should your room be too dead or too live, too big or too small, kind of stuff like that. You should just go listen to that. That'll kind of solve your decision making on that process. Yeah. But yeah, if it's a problem, it needs to be dealt with.
Yeah. Just know the room is important, even on the close mic. All right. Absolutely. Then mic placement. Like, do you have a go-to approach when it comes to that, or do you have like let's turn it around to fit the topic better? Like, is there a common mistake you see people make when it comes to putting a snare drum on the mic? A mic on the snare drum. Sorry.
That would be a problem if the snare on the mic hasn't worked well for me in the past. But, I mean, I think not really. Sometimes I see stuff and I'm like, does that work? And it sounds good. But I think if there was something, it's like way too close or way too far away. It's just one of those extremes, or not aimed at the skin at all.
Oh yeah.
There is definitely something to be said for like going at the rim or like the shell of the drum, but I think you still need that top mic no matter what.
Yeah. I think the thing that I had in mind with this is when it's not about the snare as much as it's about like the bleed, all the other stuff you're going to capture in the snare mic. Yeah. So if you want to use your natural snare and not just go with samples, and you put the mic on the snare in a way that you don't properly reject the hi-hats, for example, and like the snare mic is full of hi-hat bleed. Again, if the hi-hat sounds great, then maybe that's not a problem. But usually, let's say you have a very dark sounding snare, that's not bad, but you want to add a bunch of top end to it, or maybe the drummer doesn't hit hard enough and you need to compress it more to add more smack, more attack. You're going to bring the hi-hat bleed up. And this usually sounds pretty bad and weird because it's off axis. It's not like the full picture of the hi-hat. It's like in the middle and not to the side where it should be usually. And it's like, so you can't treat the snare like you want to because you're introducing other problems. And that is usually like the hi-hat bleed that just becomes too loud and annoying. So you're limited with what you can do to the snare, and you don't end up getting the sound you want. Then you have to make this weird compromise. You have to gate the snare really hard, or you can't EQ it as much, you can't compress it as much. And that can be the reason for a bad snare sound. Not because the placement itself was bad, but because there's other stuff in the mic that prevents you from doing the treatment necessary to achieve the sound.
Right. Yeah, that is such a good call. It didn't really occur to me, but yeah, every time I place a drum, it's always like, it's the primary kind of positioning of it, of like where on the side of the drum kit it is where those hi-hats are. It's just automatic built in now, is try and reject those hi-hats as much as I can as a default.
Yeah. Comes down to playing technique also and drum setup, like put the hi-hats as far away, as high up as possible, play them controlled, hit the snare loud, all that goes together, but it's also the placement. It's like
totally
one part of it. Yeah. Okay. Now, compression. I'll start, but I want to hear your opinion. So what I mean by that, why compression can be the reason for a shitty sounding snare, is that you could not compress it enough, or you could over compress it, or you could like compress it the wrong way. So oftentimes when people mix themselves, they don't know that in order to achieve a certain sound, you have to compress the snare pretty hard. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes you want to, like if you want that extra punch, extra smack, there are different ways to achieve that. But oftentimes that has to do with a compression technique to make it sound as if the drummer hit even harder than they already did. Right. So might be that you are keeping a pretty natural sounding snare drum because you're afraid of compressing it too much when you actually have to really smash it to get that sound. Sometimes that's the case, but the opposite can be true as well. Maybe it's totally fine because the player was great, the snare drum was great, everything was perfect, and it just needs a touch of compression, maybe it needs some automation, and you still smash it because you've seen somebody do that, and in your case, that might be the wrong decision. So there can be too much, there can be too little, but it's a very important thing, and I've seen both of those things go wrong all the time. So
yeah, I mean, I don't really have anything to add to that. It's you should never do anything without an intention in mind. So if you're just compressing it because that's what you saw somebody else do, please stop. Just don't do it unless there's a reason. Like, it should sound like you need it compressed, right? There's kind of this theory that I've been thinking about a lot, and it's like I've just been self-assessing how I mix things, and I've been realizing that when I think about my mixing as editing, I get some really good results. So I'm not compressing to make the snare sound better. I'm compressing to change the performance. I'm EQing to change how the drummer hit the drum. It's editing more than it is mixing. I mean, it's not, but if I think about it that way, I get some really great results. So compression is a tool to make the drummer more consistent, make him hit harder, change the tack of how he hits the drum, right? That's like a form of editing in a way. So always think about, why am I doing this with every single step?
Yeah, agreed. And sometimes also it's worth also thinking about how much compression to apply to the different layers, if you will. Like, what I mean is, there's this close mic layer, then there are the overheads and the stuff that's not really close, but also not like far away, and then there's the room mics. And oftentimes, to me, it makes a lot of sense to keep the close mics pretty dynamic if the performance allows that. If it's like hit consistently and like sounds great, sometimes it's worth keeping the natural attack and leaving that pretty much untouched. Maybe applying some parallel compression or something that doesn't mess with it too much. But then the further away you go from the kit, you can like start to compress more or like mess with it more. You can, like, room mics can be really squashed, and that character of a really compressed snare in the rooms can add to, like, combined with the pretty natural close mic, can lead to a very great result. So oftentimes it can sound pretty compressed and full of energy and impact, but the close mic is often not the thing that's compressed really hard. Often it's the room mics, and the combination makes it work. So it's worth thinking about this and not like smashing every single like layer the same way. Or that's at least how I think about it. But it highly depends on the performance. So I totally agree with you that we are optimizing the performance, and sometimes the tuning. We can make a snare sound a little longer, a little more ringy, a little shorter, whatever, like with compression. But doing that wrong can totally mess up a snare sound.
Definitely. Yeah, next on our list was EQ, and it's for the same reason.
Yeah,
just it can totally butcher a sound, and it's worth mentioning that, like, going overboard with an EQ probably is screwing with your phase as well, which brings us back to the phase problem, which was like at the top of our list. So you really shouldn't have to do that much, but it's tricky because I say that, but sometimes you totally have to do a lot.
Yeah, it's similar to the compression. Like, the two things that can happen are, you're afraid to EQ enough, and you don't do enough when your snare actually needs a lot of EQ, or you are doing a lot when it actually doesn't need a lot. So both things can be true. And I think, like, I've seen this, you've probably heard it. I even sent an email out a couple of weeks ago to my email list where I quoted Chris Lord Alge, who said in an interview that he sometimes boosts like the top band of his SSL EQ all the way, like 12 dB or whatever, and then he adds another instance as a plugin and boosts 12 dB again on the snare drum if he has to, and he's just like, no one's gonna die, if that's what I have to do. I have to do that, like, so don't be afraid to do a lot if that's what you need to do. No one's gonna die, but don't do that if you already have a very bright snare. So, like, it's, the most common things to me when it comes to EQ, like, two things I think of immediately when I think about wrong EQ are, if you have too much of the cardboard cheap sort of frequencies in there. So to me, that's like the 600 to 800, 1K, maybe like this mid-range thing, 700, somewhere there. I usually take out quite a bit of that because depending on the room and all that, this is the cheap area to me. on many snare drums. So if you have too much of that in there, it can just sound not good, not professional. At the same time, if you scoop it out too much, it can be very fake and weird sounding. So it's
it's a balance for sure.
Important. Yeah. And then the other thing I think about is when people add top end to a snare drum to make it cut through better or to make it brighter, I think a lot of people add the very annoying stuff where you want like I'd say like the upper mid range or the lower highs. So like if you boost 3K, 4K, 5K, that sort of area, it adds a lot of crack and it makes the snare cut through, but it can get very annoying very soon. And I personally don't really like that sound. So I like to use a broader shelf most often, and I set the frequency higher than that. I like to boost 8K, 10K or something on a snare drum and more broad and like more musical. And that opens up the whole thing and keeps it sounding natural. But if you do like these narrow boosts in the upper mid range that a lot of people do, or that I hear on a lot of mixes, that just sounds fake and like harsh and annoying to me often. Like a little bit, it always depends on the source. But a little bit can be cool, but oftentimes people do too much of that. At least that's how I think about it.
Me and my buddy were chatting, and we stumbled upon this like shared pet peeve of like, I challenge anybody to go find a tutorial made by a plugin company that makes an EQ, and it's just like I'll be shocked if the first thing they don't do is just boost high end with their magic EQ that sounds great. You know, like it's like this like little thing where they're like, hey, we're trying out our new EQ on the snare drum and we just boost the high end 10 dB. Listen to how good that sounds with no context. And it's like, we're all being trained subliminally by YouTube to just boost high end every single time we open an EQ. And it's not good. It's not true. It's not, it should not be a default movement. And it is resulting in these overly bright, weird sounding mixes. So careful with that.
Yeah, agreed. All right. Cool. So, and then the next thing to me is limiting clipping.
I'm curious.
Okay, I was about to ask you if you have some standard procedure, or if you use limiters and clippers on a snare drum at all, or what do you think about when you hear limiting clipping in the context of snare sound?
For sure. I definitely clip my snares. I usually don't have like a limiter directly on one, but there's usually a limiter hitting my snare somewhere in the mix, you know, because snares go loud and hit limiters.
Yeah.
But it's normally not right on the plugin. That said, I'm sure it could be done and could work. Where I thought you might be going with this is like straight up distortion on the snare. And
it's part of it.
That is definitely like the sign of a crappy sounding snare, is like you hit it and it's like, oh, that sounds like clipping, like bad clipping. I clip, but you shouldn't hear it, you know?
Yeah, exactly. So adding distortion to a snare is a pretty common thing and a good thing if done well. So the subtle distortion from clipping or from hitting some analog gear or some simulation of that hard, that is actually desirable often. Like it adds a little more thump, like the 200 area oftentimes gets a little more pronounced, and it's like, it can be a good thing, but you have to know what you're doing. And you don't want it to sound like it's just breaking up, unless it's intentional, of course. But so yeah, I agree. Where I was going with this was, what I was thinking about was, you might have done everything correctly on your snare drum and maybe even on your drum bus, but maybe you mastered your song yourself, or somebody mastered it and they just totally overlooked what the master limiter or the limiter on the mix bus or wherever did to the actual snare transient and the snare sound. So you can do everything correctly and completely ruin your snare on the master if you don't pay attention to that, because like usually you should control that before the master, but you can ruin it in the master as well. So if you just cranking it up for the sake of like for just getting more loudness out of it, and you're not paying attention to how that actually sounds, like if you only care about level, you can completely push your snare into the mix, almost make it disappear, like the attack of it, and that can ruin the impact, the whole feel of the drum kit. It's just, you got to be very careful with that. So usually in a rock mix, the first, like the two things that trigger the limiter first are the snare and the kick, depending on the balance of everything. Like sometimes it's the kick, sometimes it's the snare. For me, it's most often the snare. And if I go to my mix bus or my mastering chain and I look at the limiter and how much it does, if I see that it's only affecting the snare and it does like 5 dB or so and everything else is untouched, I usually go back to my mix and fix something so that this doesn't happen. something is usually off. But because if I move forward with that, I might have to kill my snare on the master in order to get to the desired loudness and to control everything else. So I'm just saying that even if you don't use a limiter on your snare, some limiter somewhere in your processing or in the mastering or on the mix bus definitely affects it. And you have to be careful with that and listen for that. So that's basically what I'm saying. And there's intentional limiting and clipping, and it's adding a sound to the snare and all that, and it's controlling the snare. So to me, it's limiting controls the snare, makes it more consistent, but it's like a tiny bit that I use on a snare drum sometimes or on the drum bus. And clipping is not so much about controlling, at least for me, it's about when after it's been controlled, after I've taken off a dB or two with the limiter, I might add a clipper to add a consistent intentional distortion because I like the sound of it. Or maybe I use it on the master to add a little bit of loudness without the side effects of limiting. Some clippers can do that very transparently. They just chop off the transients instead of ducking the snare into the mix. Like that's a difference. So I do all of that intentionally. But if you don't do it intentionally, if you're just trying to raise the level and you just throw something on there, chances are you're going to ruin your snare sound.
Yeah, you do have to be careful. And I love that little tip in there of checking to see how much your limiter is working against your snare early on in the mixing, because that is such like a dead giveaway of, I mean, that's kind of what this whole episode's about, is hyper-focus on the snare sound. And because of that, we end up pushing it louder than it needs to be often, because it feels like it's fatter. The louder the snare is, the more fat it feels like, because those frequencies are just less, they're not competing with other stuff. But that doesn't really work at the end of the day. You have to find a compromise, not a compromise even, but you just have to get it right in, I don't even know how to say this, but it's probably too loud. It's too loud or too uncontrolled. So it might not even be too loud, but maybe it's just not controlled enough and you need to put a clipper or whatever, or some saturation on the snare to tame those peaks. And then, so you don't have to do as much on the master. So it could be both, but it could be just too loud. So, but just checking it is worth it. Yes.
Next thing here is samples or lack thereof. So it could just be that you're using the wrong sample that just doesn't work well with your source tone, or that the samples are too obvious and it's just too fake sounding. You get the machine gun sound and you don't want that. You're using one shots for all the like very fast fills or whatever. Like that can sound very weird, of course. Or the opposite is true. Maybe you are, and that's pretty often the case, maybe you are afraid of using samples, or you think they sound weird, or you shouldn't do it, or your favorite drummer doesn't use some, or whatever. So you're not using samples. And that's the reason for your snare sounding like shit, because you should have used samples to get rid of your shitty snare drum. So I hear that so often. Like people would send me mixes and I'm like, yeah, I would probably do something about the snare. And they're like, yeah, that's actually intentional and cool because we don't want to use samples. And I'm like, okay, but like... It's
intentional, but it's not cool.
Yeah, but just to me, it just doesn't sound good. So, if you have to explain what you've done, if you have to explain that to your listener, it's probably a bad thing. So if it's just not cool sounding, just use samples, or don't use samples, or use different ones if the samples you're using don't work. So either way, I think samples can be the reason for your snare to not sound great.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a total art to effectively using samples and making them sound real. Like that's something that took a long time to really figure out, and I'm always experimenting with that still. Just like finding ways to gel them in there, make them do their job even better. And I've been on both sides of this. I've been just being like, no, let's not go down that road, and then regretted it later because it would have just made it more professional sounding. Or vice versa. Been way too stoked on how my one-shot snare is sounding, and it's just like not human enough. So it's like, this is going to take a while. The reason I'm mentioning this is because when you're first trying it, that might lead you to jump to conclusions and make biases about if samples are good or not. So if you first try one, you don't know how to do it, and it sounds like a machine gun every time you're like the drums are playing, like that's probably not the sample's fault. It's more so an experience with using samples.
Yeah, agreed. Totally. All right. So the next one I'm not going to start. I'm going to ask you. And that is, because that's so different for everybody, like, do you use and enjoy reverb on snare drums, on drums? Or are you like, nope, no reverb for me, I just get the ambience out of the close mics or the room mics or whatever?
There is, it depends. Yeah, both. Okay. What I don't almost ever do is I almost never use reverb on samples. If I want reverb or like room sound on my samples, there's going to be like a room sound sample. And I would say that generally is how I get like most of my room sound is either from the live snare mic, like in the room, or from a sample, rather than a reverb. But that's not to say that I don't use. I have a reverb bus in my mix template that I like always try, but I try it on the direct snare mic. It's really the only place it gets used.
Okay, cool. Yeah, agree. I'm not a big fan of reverbs on drums that sound like obvious reverb, unless it's like an intentional, like artistic decision. Sometimes you want that, but usually for most things, I don't enjoy listening to drums where I can obviously hear a reverb. Like the only exception would be like an 80s style gated reverb sort of thing that's like just has to be there in some genres. That's like really cool. But for anything modern, some like sort of organic sounding band music, I enjoy room ambience much more. And I don't care if it's samples or real or whatever. I like it is real. It's just a different approach. So I don't care. But I don't like obvious reverb on most of those things, especially like on, we're talking about snares, but usually you want to apply that ambience or reverb to like several parts of the kit to make it work. And I especially don't like it on toms when there's this clicky sounding obvious reverb tail, this weird thing that often happens. I don't like that. And I tend to, if I use reverb, I tend to use darker reverbs to just add some depth and some length, but without the annoying you often get in the reverb tail. So I don't want that usually. And I ever really use it to maybe add a little bit of length and depth to it. Maybe if it's a super dead snare drum and I want to add a little bit of length, I use a short reverb to just add a little bit of that. Sometimes I like a plate or something just for some depth. Depends on the genre. Sometimes I use it as an effect in certain parts or in an individual hit right before a break or something. That can be cool. But the reason I've added it to this list is because I've heard so many mixes where people just add a bunch of reverb because they don't have room mics and they didn't use room samples and they just don't want to have a really dry kit, so they add a lot of reverb. But it sounds like artificial reverb and it's not like really tasteful to me. So that might be the reason why your snare sounds like shit, because of the reverb tail that makes it weird. I don't know.
Yeah, totally. I would be willing to bet that if we pulled up a mix that had this going on, like there's way too much reverb stuff happening to their drum sound, that person spent way too much time in solo on their snare mic.
Probably.
And just were like, this sounds really cool, and now that's how it lives in my mix. Snare, I'm not even just snare reverb, but just reverb on drums can really muddy things up. Another reason I think it happens more often than it should is because reverb is kind of hard to hear if you don't have good monitoring. So you might not really be aware of like the soup that you've created. the sonic soup.
Sonic soup.
So yeah, it's definitely something to be careful of. I've done some mixes where there is just zero reverb on the drums and like not even like a room sound sample or anything, and it totally sounds awesome and punchy. It's not a necessity. It will sneak into the close mics, and your overheads are going to create some of that vibe as well. So it's probably one of the more overused effects in music.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Andrew Sheps said this in an interview that I've listened to where he was like on some of the Audio Slave stuff that he mixed, where I really enjoy how the drums sound like they sound. There is ambience and it's like long and ringy and it's like rumble and it sounds like a real kit. It's distorted and like it's just the feeling you have when you stand next to a kit in a room. It doesn't sound like close mics. But he didn't use any reverb on that, and not even room mics, I think, or just very tiny bits of room mics, like a small amount. He just gets that from squashing the close mics hard enough, like the energy of the kit. You have to know what you're doing there, of course, but this totally doesn't sound like a dry kit, but it actually is. It's just mangled, and like there's the ring and everything just is brought up with the mixing techniques he used. And so, because he also doesn't really enjoy reverb on drums, at least that's what he said there. And yeah, so you can create a big sounding drum sound. You can create depth and all of that without actually having to use reverb.
Totally, yeah. There's other ways around it for sure. Cool. When you like massively distort or compress a snare mic, you are bringing all of that ambience that was like you couldn't hear before. You're making it louder, and eventually you're going to hear it, and that can be really cool. Yeah, advanced technique though.
Yeah, totally. All right. So, and then this last one, that you put that on the list, and I think it's really cool. You said, "What the heck am I meant to do with this bottom mic?"
Yeah. So we kind of talked about this a little bit. I mean, this has many different angles to be considered, but there's the phase thing, that the snare bottom being out of phase with your top. Common thing that makes snare sound bad for sure, but also just like a disregard for what is the purpose of this mic. It's not just for the snare wires, if you ask me. I think that a snare bottom can add a lot of like fatness. It can add sustain, and it doesn't have to be this bright sizzly thing either. So it's just essentially all I think I want to say is just like give it more consideration and experiment with it more before you just use it because you recorded it. And actually that would be a whole nother argument in itself. Doesn't need to be there. Does the mix sound better without it?
Yeah, totally agree. I didn't think about it that way, but you're totally right. I think a lot of people don't know what to do with it, but they think they have to use it, so they just leave it as it is and then put it in the mix, and that can totally ruin your snare sound. So unless you know why you want it and you carve out the stuff that you really want to have in there and get rid of the stuff you don't want to have in there, then it's not going to go well. So you need to know what you're trying to achieve with it, how much of it you need. You need to treat it a certain way. So to me, at least, snare bottoms only work well if I have to do stuff to it to make it work. I have to filter it. I have to bring out the bright stuff. I have to make it snappy. I have to listen for, do I want to add some of the kick beater thing that like makes the snares rattle? Sometimes I want it for that. Sometimes I want it for the actual snare wires and the snap. Sometimes, I don't know, for length. Like there's different reasons to have or not have a snare bottom mic, and you need to know what those reasons are and what to do to that mic in order to make it work like that. And if you don't know why, and if your snare top just sounds fine the way it is, maybe don't use it at all.
Yeah, it is one of the trickier things to figure out how to use and how to record, because it doesn't sound good on its own.
Yeah.
You know, when you mic the top of a snare, it's really easy to be like, yeah, this sounds cool. That's like, let's run with it. And toms and kick, like they all sound like the drum, but the bottom of a snare sounds pretty awful almost always. So you have to kind of keep experimenting and figure out what you're aiming for, and then you start getting this picture in your head of like, oh, this is a nice bottom snare. We nailed it on this recording.
Yeah. Cool.
Honestly, that takes years and years.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure if I've ever said that, but
I honestly, like just yesterday, I was looking at a friend of mine's bottom snare. He sent me a track to look at. Like he actually brought over the multi tracks, and we were going through them, and I was like, this is like an incredibly nice bottom snare. It's so smooth. It's like the perfect time. Like it was insane. He really nailed it. And it was like exactly what I try to make my bottom snares often was already happening. I was so pleased.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great news. All right, cool. I think we've covered a lot here, and I hope this helps you make better snare sounds in the future, or at least know what it is that your current snare sound is lacking. And
yeah, that was possibly too comprehensive.
Could be. We went pretty fast. We had a long list to go through, but you can always re-listen. You can slow down the playback speed and listen to us sound like drunk people if you want to. You can make notes. And as always, if you have like techniques that have worked for you, or like some tricks that we don't know of or haven't talked about in this episode, just let us know. Like go to the selfrecordingband.com/community and just post it in there. Let us know your thoughts. And there will be a discussion thread to this episode there. But you can also just open up a thread, make a post about what you like to do to your snare drums, or maybe share a story of what hasn't worked in the past or something you're struggling with, whatever. So if you are also in the camp, like my snare sounds like shit, then just let us know and we'll try to help you with that.
Yeah. One funny self-deprecating story is that I did a mix for a band really early in my career. I was still an intern at this time, I think, and sent it off for mastering. And then I think I knew at the time it sucked. I think I did. I convinced myself I didn't. But I was going through that phase of like, I'm a professional, but I really sucked. And anyways, years later, I'm doing this like online course thing. And I kind of signed up for this like optional challenge where you get paired with other people in the course. And one of them is this guy, Shane, that I recognize his name. Couldn't figure out how. We start talking on one of our Zoom calls and he's like, oh, your name, I know it. I mastered something of yours. And he's like, I mastered this album. And I was like, oh, shit. This is years later. Come so far. And even this was years ago now. And I was like, honestly, if there's one thing that I wish You hadn't heard. That's the one. And he's like, that snare was generous. That's what he said. That snare was generous because it was so loud.
Yeah. That's funny.
So if you're feeling bad after listening to this, we've all been there, buddy. Don't worry about it.
So absolutely. All right, I remember myself drooling over like the Killswitch Engage metalcore 2000 sort of sound where I just didn't know what samples were and how to use them, and I just heard those snare drums and I like that. It's impossible to make a normal snare drum sound like that. Like, how the hell did I do that? And I like that was bothering me for years until I figured out how they did it. But yeah, we've all been there.
Yes, we've all been there. Right on. Okay.
All right.
Well,
thank you for listening.
Thank you again for listening, everyone.
See you next week. Bye-bye.